Woo! Pig, Suey, Razorbacks. Had to give a shout out to my Hogs for beating Penn State in the Outback Bowl on New Year's Day. Hogs 9-4 this year after back-to-back seasons where they didn't win an SEC game. So I'm very proud of my Hogs. Okay, I'm here to talk to you all about the remainder of Chapter 18, starting with Section 3 on Science and Faith, Realism in the Arts, Religion, Diversity, and Innovation, and finishing up the chapter there. Okay, so here, let's talk about this, all right? When we had wrapped up for the Christmas holidays, we talked about Chapter 18, and we had looked at the consumer culture, masculinity, and the rise of sports. We talked about the great outdoors. We talked about the Comstock Act. We had talked about education, African American education, and women's education during that particular time period, and so on. So what we're going to look at now is that we're going to talk about from Science and Faith, Darwinism, and its critics. All right? So, Science and Faith, Darwinism, and critics. Theory. In his 1859 book, On the Origin of Species, Darwin argued that creatures struggle to survive, but some are born with mutations that make them a better fit for their environment, the theory of natural selection. These characteristics then become dominant in future generations. Okay? Very influential book. Now, one of the things that happens, though, with Darwinism is that people begin to use it in ways that Charles Darwin never ever intended. And that's where social Darwinism comes in, where people begin to take this idea of survival of the fittest and to bring it into our world and to bring it into the social world, into our society, and use it to explain why things are the way they are in our American society, which is not anything that Charles Darwin ever intended. So this is a misuse of the theory of natural selection. But here's what it is. Social Darwinism. It's an elaborate theory developed by Herbert Spencer, the British philosopher. Humans had advanced through competition and survival of the fittest. William Graham Sumner, a sociologist at Yale, claimed the wealthy were the fittest, and therefore they should be at the top of the heap. And so that's why we have social classes in America with the wealthiest at the top, is that they're just the fittest. Sumner's views were controversial, and critics argued that Spencer and others, French biologist Jean-Baptiste Lamarck, for example, were making excuses for the excesses of the industrial society. Now, when you push this idea of social Darwinism even farther, then therefore if you have certain social classes where you have the fittest at the top and so on like this, then you could say that the people at the bottom are the unfit. And therefore, when you take Darwinism a step further into social Darwinism and then go from social Darwinism a step farther, then the unfittest, then you begin to get to the point where people here should be at the top and they should be allowed to live, and the people down here that are unfit, that are less than those at the top, then they don't have a right to exist. So you have the development of what's called eugenics, the so-called science of human breeding that argued that mentally deficient people should be prevented from reproducing. Eugenics proposed sterilization laws. Many people associated mental deficiency with so-called lower races, which led to an increased discrimination against people of Asian, African, and Native American descent. Now you take this one step further into Nazi Germany, and remember, in the early 1900s, there are about 10 German universities that were considered the top universities in the world. They bought into this idea of survival of the fittest. They bought into this social Darwinism idea. They bought into this idea of eugenics. And you get into the 1920s with a madman like Adolf Hitler, to the point where he begins to believe that these lower races or lesser races, according to him, were unfit to live, and it was okay to exterminate them. So you go from Charles Darwin's theory of this survival of the fittest, and you push it so far into what happens with Adolf Hitler, and it gets crazy in Nazi Germany in the 1930s and the 1940s. So just be aware of how dangerous it is to misuse a scientific theory. Charles Darwin's theory is a theory about biology, and people use it to clamp it down on society, and it didn't work. Next, realism in the arts. Okay? If you notice, one of the most popular art forms during this time period, the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, is Impressionism. There's a reaction to Impressionism because Impressionist paintings are all beautiful and colorful and all those kinds of things. And so you have this move away from that toward realism there and naturalism. So naturalism in art suggested that human beings were victims of forces beyond their control, impulses and desires. Some examples include Stephen Crane's book Maggie, A Girl of the Streets, or Jack London's story The Law of Life, or Mark Twain's A Connecticut Yankee in King Arthur's Court. So you begin to see naturalism in literature. And then you begin to have modernism in art. They rejected traditional canons of literary taste. They focused in on subconscious and primitive mind. They sought to overturn convention and tradition, including religious skeptics and atheists. They questioned progress. Some photographers argued that their true representations made painting obsolete. Remember, by this time, paintings have become, photography has become a clear way to show pictures and images as they really are. But painters invented their own form of realism. The Armory Show in 1913 introduced America to modern art, including Cubism. It was met with both controversy and fascination. Also during this time period, you begin to have religious diversity and innovation. Immigrant faith. The arrival of large numbers of Catholics and Jews to question whether immigrants should adapt their faith to American Protestantism. Connection to churches decreased because of the harshness of industrial society. Immigrant Catholics established parishes based on ethnicities, Irish, Polish, Italian. Native-born American Jews embraced Reform Judaism, abandoning such religious practices as keeping a kosher kitchen and conducting services in Hebrew, meaning that they would conduct them in English. Some Jews founded Orthodox synagogues as well, though, to keep up with their traditions. So there's going to be a challenge of religion in our society during this time period. The Protestants also don't just stand idly by. There's Protestant innovations. In 1916, Protestants were still the majority in the U.S., but they faced increasing political pressure from large numbers of Catholics. Protestants worked to evangelize those who were uncommitted to religion through the social gospel movement. Protestants founded YMCA's Young Men's Christian Association. They revealed faith through their public welfare and social justice efforts. There was an introduction in the U.S. of a British organization called the Salvation Army, to help help to reform poor sinners in slums from alcoholism, prostitution, and gambling. So the Salvation Army came to us from England during this time period. Also, during this time period, you have fundamentalist Christian religion, too. These are conservatives who are concerned about the rising secularism of the country being less religious. A series of Bible conferences at Niagara Falls were held between 1876 and 1897. They reaffirmed the literal truth of the Bible and the certain damnation of those not born again in Christ. They used revival meetings. Billy Sunday, a former professional baseball player, helped to bring evangelism into the modern era and held revivals to reconnect Americans with Protestant religion. He was wildly popular during this time period. Now, the rise of these Christian fundamentalists, they interpret the Bible differently than the way it had been interpreted by traditional Protestants, as well as Catholics, as well as Jews, how they interpreted the Hebrew Bible, which is the Protestants and Catholics' Old Testament. And so what these folks believed in is that they believed, the fundamentalists believed in the Bible word for word was dictated by God to those who wrote it down, that it was God's literal word, and everything that was written in there was said exactly by God the way God wanted to say it, and did not take in the more traditional ways of looking at the different parts of the Bible, the literature, the Psalms, the stories, the parables, and things like that and stuff as the way it had been looked at for over 1,000 years, a couple thousand years. And so they're going to have a very different point of view that's going to lead to the rise of fundamental Christian belief in America, which is still strongly with us today, this idea of literally believing the Bible and everything. So anyway, something's interesting, something's on the horizon. We'll talk more about fundamentalism when we get into the 1920s, especially when we look at the Scopes monkey trial. So anyway, I just wanted to finish up Chapter 18 for you guys, and I wish you guys the best. Don't forget, tomorrow is our Chapter 19 reading quiz, and we'll see you then. Take care.